Today we take up the remaining part of the United Nations organization. When we take up the remaining part of the United Nations organization, we have two important principal organs which are to be covered. Now the first organ which we are going to cover today is the Secretariat of the United Nations. Now the Office of Secretariat of the United Nations is an important office, and this important office is responsible for the day-to-day working of the office of the United Nations. Now, if you just take into consideration a bit of the prehistory of the establishment of the United Nations Secretariat, we'll have to go to the Secretariat or the Office of the League of Nations. Now, prior to the League of Nations, there were certain offices which were called as the Office of the World Chancellor or the Office of the World Statesman. But then under the League of Nations, it could not be called as the Office of the World Statesman or the World Chancellor. It was called as the Office of Secretariat, and the Office of Secretariat was actually the chief of the organization, the Secretary General of the League of Nations. Now, when we take into consideration the Office of the Secretary General of the League of Nations, the League of Nations was able to bring in the best of officers who were either British or French civil servants. Now, when I speak about the British or the French civil servants, one of them happened to be Eric Drummond. Eric Drummond happened to be a brilliant civil servant of the state of England. And as the first Secretary General of the League of Nations, he was able to establish and set up certain practices. And these practices at a later stage were considered as good practices. And these good practice which was established and cultivated by him, which was later followed by others, were good enough even for the United Nations as well. That is why he is remembered. Now the second person happened to be Robert Avenol. Robert Avenol happened to be an officer of the state of France, and this person was equally good. So these are the two people who actually laid down certain precepts, practices which were accepted, admired, applauded and appreciated by the people and the states throughout the world. That is why it functioned as an effective organization until these people served the League of Nations. There was another civil servant which I just intend to make a mention of him, Albert Thomas. Albert Thomas happened to be a great civil servant, and this person who actually was the head or the Secretary General of the International Labour Organization. The International Labour Organization as well as the Permanent Court of International Justice were later established by the League of Nations. Thanks to the League of Nations for establishing these organizations. And the ILO was headed by him, and this person was responsible in the formative periods in establishing certain labour codes. And these labour codes which were provided or chartered or drafted and put forth and put into force by Albert Thomas. Albert Thomas is just remembered to posterity. One important aspect we have to remember, generally the office of the Secretary General anywhere depends upon the person and his personal choices. And remember, the ability of the man to carry on certain things and the ability to give respect and take respect, and afterwards remember command respect outside. That is where I just made a mention of these two or three important officers. They did it and they contributed it, and they are known to posterity even to this day. And the textbooks in the area of international law covering Secretariat naturally make a mention of these three great people. Now, with which we go to discuss something relating to the Office of Secretary General under the United Nations. Now, when we take up the Office of Secretary General, naturally the Office of Secretary General has to be done by the Security Council as well as the General Assembly of the United Nations. It is these two organs sit together and then select a particular officer as the Secretary General of the United Nations. Now, the mode of selection of the Secretary General is the important thing in which we are interested, how he is selected. Now, first and foremost, the Security Council will discuss the prospects of one or two or three candidates, and having considered the ability, competence, integrity and the serving capacity of two or three officers, they will prefer but one. Having preferred one candidate, they will just recommend this person to the General Assembly of the United Nations. And the General Assembly of the United Nations, remember, takes a decision in appointing such person as the Secretary General of the United Nations. So you may be interested to know they prefer but one. Now they prefer but one for the simple reason the Security Council is composed of the big five. The concerned candidate who is recommended by the Security Council should be acceptable to all the five. And if he is acceptable to all the five, whenever he speaks something, he speaks on behalf of the United Nations. Now suppose, for example, a Secretary General is not liked by one of the permanent members of the Security Council. Now in such situations, if he speaks something before the public, and if it is countered by that state which did not like him, naturally the entire mission, the purpose, the object and the objective for which, remember, the organ is appointed gets defeated. That should not happen. That is why they discuss in private and afterwards come to a consensus. And having come to a consensus, select but one and recommend, and the General Assembly will take a decision as a resolution to this effect. And the Secretary General thus selected will hold a office for 5 years. Initially there was no period as such, but then at a later stage they decided, both the General Assembly and the Security Council decided there should be an office of the United Nations for a period of 5 years. Now when we take up this, the first Secretary General happened to be a Norwegian, and this Norwegian is popularly known as Trygve Lie. And Trygve Lie, from between 1945 to 1950, completed his tenure. A person with the grit, with wisdom, with scholarship and administrative talents was able to set up, remember, the United Nations in a good way. And remember, he was in a position to show the roadmap in the formative period of 5 years. When he completed the 5 years, the Security Council of the United Nations was not in a position to give any recommendation of a person. They said, we are not in a position to recommend anyone. At this juncture, the General Assembly unanimously appointed another person, they appointed the same person, Trygve Lie, for another 3 years period. Now when his term was extended for another 3 years, the state of Soviet Russia challenged this. But then, in spite of the challenge that was made by the state of Soviet Russia, he continued to remain there for a period of 3 years. Now afterwards he was succeeded by Dag Hammarskjöld. He is called as Dag Hammarskjöld. That is the literal pronunciation. Now this person was a powerful speaker, like a statesman and he happened to be a Swedish man, and he commanded respect. And it was during his tenure he was able to assert many things, and he was able to put pressure on the Security Council to take a decision. And he was the man who used to put things before the Security Council's agenda. Naturally, if the Security Council was not in a position to take a decision, the agenda he voluntarily shifted to the General Assembly, and the General Assembly was made to take a decision. Now this is how we find the Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld. Remember, he died in an accident, in an air accident in the year 1961. Then for the remaining period, the United Nations Security Council and the General Assembly elected a moderate person by name U Thant. Thereafterwards we have plenty of them who became the Secretary Generals, of which I shall tell you in a little while from now. Now the when we discuss the powers and functions of the Secretary General of the United Nations, you should remember he is the administrative head and he is the executive of the United Nations as well. When I speak about the administrative head of the United Nations, he is called the Secretary General. Now, when he, as a Secretary General of the United Nations, he has to remember the powers are being put in Article 97, 98, 99, 100 and 101 of the Charter of United Nations. Now, first and foremost thing which I just wanted to tell you, he is the depository of almost all the treaties. Now, many United Nations treaties or international treaties or conventions are being signed, and he is the depository. And you may be interested to know why, what purpose is going to be served by remaining a depository. Now, you will come to know for each treaty how many of them have originally signed and then ratified. And those states who did not ratify, how many of them have acceded to a later stage by way of ratification. And all these statistics are maintained by him. That is why he is a depository of almost all the United Nations treaties at the office of the United Nations. And this is a major function which is being exercised by the Secretary General of the United Nations. Now, the second important thing that is being spoken under this is he has two important functions. One is the financial function. Now, when I speak about the financial function and the administrative functions, let me speak to you first the administrative functions. When we speak about the administrative functions, he is, remember, the coordinator or the chief coordinator of the activities of the United Nations. You may be interested to know what is this chief coordinator's role. There are many, more than 50 specialized agencies. There are many international organizations. And the meetings of these, remember, it is the Secretary General's office convenes the meeting of this. And as the convener of the meetings, remember, he has the responsibility to see that the proper agendas are prepared. And these agendas, when they are prepared, they should be discussed. And they should be discussed in what way, in what approach, under what line. These are to be made known in the circulars which are being sent to the participants before the meeting. And this is a major function. Don't be under the impression that when he discusses certain things, it is like a random discussion, anything, you can speak and anything. States or the other international institutions, when they are called for meeting, they are briefed properly. And when the representatives of the international institutions, they participate in the meeting, they should prepare and go. And whatever documentation which is required to be produced there should be produced by them in the meeting. And he may, remember, give or seek advisory opinion from certain organizations as well. He may request for help or may take advice. Simultaneously, in the capacity of the Secretary General of the United Nations, he has the power to advise to any organization or to any state, even if it asks for an advice from the Secretary General of the United Nations. Now, when I speak about coordination of work is the most important job under the system of United Nations. Now, you may be interested to know what exactly you mean by coordination of work. Now, first is when you have several organizations, their work had to be coordinated properly. And he should avoid duplication of work. Suppose, for example, there are certain states. When they request for assistance, they will be requesting for assistance from several organizations. Now, the Office of Secretary General determines the concerned application to which organization it should be referred to. Otherwise, remember, the application will be there before several organizations and no discussion will be taking place on that. And even if some decision is taken, others will not come to know about it. So with the result, the process is being done by the Office of Secretary General to avoid duplication of work. And if this is not avoided, remember, there you should have lots and lots of people. So the Office of Secretary General avoids duplication of work. With the result, the United Nations will be in a position to concentrate with a concerted effort. And this concerted effort is very much essential to realize the goals, the objectives and the purposes of the United Nations, and that work is being done by the Secretary General of the United Nations. Now another important thing is, he is the one who prepares the budget of the United Nations. When he prepares the budget of the United Nations, remember, he has to prepare the budget for the entire expenses of the United Nations. You might be knowing there are certain economic activities functioning under the Economic and Social Council. And remember, money is required and grants are required. Developmental activities have to take place. Commissions, when they are appointed, they should be allowed to function properly, and for which financial assistance has to be given. And a budget systematically, with a great vision for the future, he has to prepare. Yearly budget will be prepared, and once it is prepared, he will get it scrutinized with other organizations. He will call experts of all the specialized agencies and other organizations of the United Nations, and he will have a discussion for at least 15 days, and then he will finalize with the help of the financial experts, and then he will submit it. Then there will be a thorough discussion by the General Assembly, then it will be accepted, and there will be huge financial implications on states as well. Now, in addition to, when he prepares the budget, he will allocate himself some resources, and these resources are very much essential for him to tackle certain political issues as well. Suppose, for example, there will be an upsurge, and this upsurge which is taking place in a particular state is going to result in the violation of international peace and security. In situations like this, he can send a commission and to ascertain the facts. Either he can send a commission or experts, or himself may go to the spot and try to pacify the parties, and so this problem is solved, for which some allocation of funds are required, and which he is empowered to do, and which has been going on until the present by the Office of Secretary General of the United Nations. Then thereafterwards, the most important function of the Secretary General is the preparation of the annual report. The Secretary General of the United Nations is supposed to prepare, and he prepares and submits the annual report to the organs of the United Nations. Now, annual report of the United Nations is very much essential. It is not only essential for the states, to the members of the United Nations, to the Security Council, to the other organs, but even, remember, experts in the area of financial matters and security matters. Generally, some scholars go to the extent of saying that the annual report prepared by the Secretary General of the United Nations is important because, in addition to giving the statistics, it actually reviews the world's peace situation. When I speak about it reviews the world's peace situation, simply meant now the stability of peace in Asia, the stability of peace in Africa, in Western Europe, in Latin America, in the Far East. All matters are covered in the annual report, and it will be very handy even for students who study international relations. That is the relevance that is being attached to the report of the Security Council, the report of the Secretary General of the United Nations. Now, the other function of the Secretary General happened to be the executive function. When I speak about the executive function, remember, he carries out the executive function because he is the chief spokesperson. And when he is the chief spokesperson, whatever he speaks will have a lot of effect on international peace and security, because he is an acceptable candidate to all the big five, and it is the big five with the consensus have elected him. And when he speaks, the entire big five permanent members are behind him, and he becomes the spokesperson or the mouthpiece of the United Nations and commands respect when he says something. Now, the other thing is, when he is in the capacity of the executive, he has the power to keep certain issues relating to international peace and security by way of an agenda before the Security Council. Now, you take, for instance, the other day, I just spoke to you about the Korean crisis, North Korea, when it was invaded by South Korea in the year 1950, the issue came up. The Secretary General of the United Nations kept this matter immediately for deliberation by the Security Council of the United Nations. And thereafterwards, remember, a decision was taken by the Security Council in the absence of the state of Soviet Russia. Now, immediately thereafterwards, when there was a deadlock, when it was challenged, the matter was kept by the Secretary General before the agenda of the General Assembly of the United Nations. Now, the very purpose of doing this is, remember, international peace and security should not be allowed to be escalated. Under all circumstances, it should be minimized and it should be kept under control, and the Secretary General or the Office of Secretary General functions for this all through, all day, all years. This is a fundamental fact. Now, you might be knowing in the year 1966, the Congo crisis took place. When the Congo crisis took place, again, it was the Secretary General of the United Nations who kept the matter before the agenda of the Security Council. And 3 resolutions, remember, came in later by the General Assembly. The Security Council could not do anything. Initially it agreed, thereafter it was challenged by the state of Poland and Soviet Russia. And it was the Secretary General who kept the matter in the agenda of the General Assembly, and the General Assembly thereafterwards, remember, accepted or passed unanimously 3 resolutions in the month of July and 1 in the month of August. Now, for which he is responsible. Now, the other important factor is he is empowered to, remember, take the agenda from the table of the Security Council and keep it before the General Assembly. Now, this has been done several times, and this is done with a view to promote international peace and security, remember, for all purposes. Now, the other function of the Secretary General happened to be he is empowered to act as a mediator as well, and an informal advisor to governments, since he knows what is happening within the United Nations and he knows the peace situations all through in all regions in the entire world. Many people just consult him to take decisions or carry forward their activities, and he does this. Now, other important function is he is the representative of the United Nations. United Nations is represented by the Secretary General before international tribunals. In a given case before the International Court of Justice, the Office of the United Nations is represented by the Secretary General. In the International Court of Arbitration or some other courts in the Mixed Claims Commissions to which United Nations is a party, it is represented by the Secretary General of his United Nations, either by himself or through his representatives or through legal counsels. Now, these are certain important powers which are being spoken of the Secretary General of the United Nations. Now, when I speak about one important thing you should remember, it is the duty and responsibility of the Secretary General of the United Nations to keep the international character of the United Nations. And that job, if he does, he will be the best of the Secretary General in all his activities all through. Now, having said this much, we will go to discuss something relating to the International Court of Justice. Now, when we speak about the International Court of Justice, I just intend to make a mention. For the first time in human history, the members of the international community wanted to have a judicial organization. Now, this judicial organization they wanted to have to settle disputes, international disputes between states. So, for purpose of settling international disputes between states, an organization came to be established under the auspicious of the League of Nations, which is known as the Permanent Court of International Justice. Now, before the Permanent Court of International Justice or its statute came into force, the League of Nations appointed a particular committee, and this committee was headed by 2 important great scholars or juries. One happened to be Lord Phillimore from the state of England, and the other person happened to be Mr. Root from the state of United States. Now, the Root and Phillimore committee discussed the matter, how the future Permanent Court of International Justice should be. And having discussed threadbare and several other things, and having consultation with several judicial officers or the judges or important people they were responsible in drafting and providing the statute of the Permanent Court of International Justice. Now we are interested in discussing only the International Court of Justice. Now when we take up the International Court of Justice, remember the mode of selection that was provided under the League of Nations is adopted even under the ICJ. So the mode or the method or the manner of selection of judges, which was part of the Permanent Court of International Justice, is also part of the Statute of the World Court. You have a Statute of the World Court, which is an integral part of the Charter of United Nations. Now, next important thing which we intend to know, how the selection process takes place. Under the United Nations International Court of Justice, the selection process takes place by taking into consideration one important aspect. That is, one is nomination and then election. Now you might be knowing the Permanent Court of Arbitration was set up earlier, and when the Permanent Court of Arbitration was set up, it was set up under the Hague Convention of 1899 and 1907. Under the Hague Convention of 1999 as well as 1907, there were certain things which are being spoken. To become, it is called as selection method. The selection method which was provided under Article 4 of the Hague Convention of 1907 is thus: each party which is a party to the statute of the Permanent Court of Arbitration of 1899 and 1907 should establish a national group. Before a national group is constituted, it should be in a position to consult the highest academies of learning in the area of international law. Having consulted, remember, they are entitled to nominate. And when they are nominated, there shall be maximum two of the nationals and two outsiders. So each state is empowered to appoint 4 members, and of which not more than 2 shall be nationals of a particular state. Now suppose, for example, a particular state is not interested in becoming a party to the statute of the Permanent Court of Arbitration. If a particular state is not interested in becoming a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration and to the statute, then it can constitute its own national group. And when it constitutes its own national group, remember, the national group shall be composed of 4 members maximum, of which not more than 2 of them shall be the nationals of that state. Now, before a national group is constituted, it is the duty to give the information, consult the information to almost all the academies or the judges or the institutions wherein you find scholars in the area of international law. And only when that is being done, remember, it is empowered to represent or nominate 2 people. And from this group, one is the group which is constituted as the national group under the Hague Convention of 1899 and 1907, constituting the Permanent Court of Arbitration, as well as the group which is not interested in becoming a party to that, but it is interested in becoming a party to the Statute of the World Court, can have their nominees, maximum 4, 2 of them shall be nationals. From the group such constituted, remember, the International Court of Justice is supposed to have 15 judges, and the General Assembly as well as the Security Council of the United Nations will sit separately. Having sat separately, they will select the number of judges, and when they select the number of judges, you require only 15. Suppose, take it this way, 13 of them get absolute majority in both the Security Council as well as the General Assembly. So whoever gets the absolute majority gets selected to the World Court. Now, remember this much: to fill in the remaining two posts, again the General Assembly and the Security Council may sit separately. And suppose, for example, nobody gets the majority. And again, it may convene a meeting, and when it convenes a meeting, remember, one of them gets selected. And they sit separately. Only one of them. Now, for the remaining one seat, both the Security Council and the General Assembly sit separately and try to select. Suppose, for example, in the meeting that is taking place separately between the Security Council and the General Assembly, nobody gets the majority. Nobody gets the absolute majority in the House. Suppose, for example, in the Security Council you have 15, means you should get at least 8 members. And in the General Assembly, if the members are 150, there should be at least absolute majority. 76 members should be there. And if they don't get, what happens is then the judges who are selected to the International Court of Justice, that is 14 of them, select the 15th man. Now we are interested to know how the 15th man is selected. The 15th man is selected from amongst the candidates who are considered by the Security Council and the General Assembly. And remember, they consider him, and thereafterwards amicably they will select. Suppose, for example, there is a division of votes or equal votes. So they have considered one candidate. When the matter is voted, remember, he gets only 7-7. Now, at that time, the President of the World Court or the person who is senior in age in the International Court of Justice, who is selected as a judge, will have a casting vote. Thus, the 15th man is selected by the court itself as a judge of the International Court of Justice. This is the mode of selection which naturally should take place under the clause that is being provided under the statute of the World Court. Now, the judges of the International Court of Justice have a service of 9 years. They are empowered to serve for a period of 9 years. So, when one's appointment is made, they hold office for a period of 9 years. Remember, under the International Court of Justice, 3 judges are elected every 5 years. When I speak about this, remember, International Court of Justice has 9 members, and 9 members, remember, hold the office, and when they hold the office, remember, what is important is the selection takes place by keeping the seniority. Every 5 judges retire in 3 years. When the 5 of the judges selected retire every 3 years, remember, as and when they retire, new judges are appointed immediately. New judges means only 5 of them are selected immediately. Now, we may be interested to know why these, what we call as judges are appointed immediately. This is generally to maintain the continuity as well as the seniority in the court. See, if all of them retire, then remember who is there, how the court proceedings have to be conducted, how it is being done, how it is better, in what way if it is done. All these things come into the picture, and that is why when the judges retire, naturally their place is taken and filled in accordance with the steps by General Assembly, and the Security Council will vote the matter, and whoever gets absolute majority will be selected as a judge of the International Court of Justice. Now, there are 2 other important qualifications that is being put. Now, one important qualification that is being put is the judges of the International Court of Justice are persons of high moral character. High moral character. And then they should have high integrity. Integrity and high moral character are the 2 qualifications and the characteristics as that is being spoken. Now, the other important thing that is being spoken is the judge who is selected as a judge of the International Court of Justice should be able to hold the highest judicial office in his own country. So, he should have the capacity or the qualification to hold the highest judicial office in his own country. That is what is being stipulated there. Now, the other important aspects when we speak about the selection of judges is being spoken. Suppose, for example, in a particular case, there is a representative of one state, but there is no representative of the other. Now you take an instance, suppose there is a dispute between India and Portugal, that is the right of passage over Indian territory. Now in the right of passage over Indian territory, suppose for example there is a judge who is already functioning as a judge of the International Court of Justice, who is a Portuguese national. But then India at that time did not have, and when India did not have, it appointed M.C. Chagla as the ad hoc judge for that purpose. Now ad hoc judge is only for that purpose, only for that decision. Ad hoc judge or ad hoc judges also are paid out of the funds of the court. Now suppose for example in a dispute, suppose there is a dispute between India and Pakistan and both of them don't have a judge. It is a hypothetical case. But India has a judge before the International Court of Justice now. Mr. Dalveer Bhandari has been the judge of the International Court of Justice now for in the last 5 or 6 years. And afterwards he is re-elected the other day. When once he completed tenure, he got re-elected as a judge of the International Court of Justice. It's not for the second term. Earlier it was for the remaining term, now full term of 9 years. Now when we take up this matter, if both the states in a dispute don't have judges, then they are permitted to appoint only for that case a judge. And the person who is sent by the concerned state will be a judge, is called as an ad hoc judge or ad hoc judges in the event they don't have judges from the representing both the countries, and they are also paid out of the funds of the court. Now a question came up, why ad hoc judges? Now ad hoc judges are supposed to inform the nitty-gritty issues involved in the concerned case to the other members of the court. When I speak about the nitty-gritty issues involved or relevant in the concerned case to the other judges. Now, for example, when the ad hoc judges are going to inform the case or the issues concerning the case, then what is the relevance of counsels? Or what we call as the law officers who argue the case before the International Court of Justice. Now it undermines the office of what we call as the law officers, or they are called as the agents before the International Court of Justice. Now having spoken about this, there is no question of retirement. Office is for 9 years. And before that, dismissal can be brought by the unanimity of other judges. So the period is absolutely 9 years. And before 9 years there cannot be retirement. But then for moral turpitude or for some such other thing, if the other remaining judges are unanimous, he can be removed from the concerned office. Thus far, no further. Now with which we go to discuss the important aspects that is being spoken about the who can be a party before the International Court of Justice. Now when we take up this matter, all members of the United Nations under Article 34 who are states are parties to the Statute of the World Court. All members of the United Nations who are parties to the Statute of the World Court can go before the court in a particular dispute. Though this is a major development that is being spoken. So suppose for example today 193 states are there as parties. All the 193 states in the event of a dispute can go before the International Court of Justice and seek redressal and claim whatever it be in the relevant case. Now the second important thing that is being spoken happened to be, remember there are certain states who are not members of the United Nations. And these states who are not members of the United Nations wants to associate with the court in a dispute. They want to, remember, become parties to the statute of the court only. So non-members of the United Nations who wants to keep association with the statute of the World Court, remember, In a dispute, they want the matter to be decided by the court. The state of Switzerland as well as the state of Liechtenstein, the state of Switzerland in 1948 as well as the state of Liechtenstein, another European state, was able to become a party to the Statute of the World Court only. So in the event of a dispute, the matter will be decided by the parties. Now then, important thing that is said here is, they have to pay certain expenses of the court. Certain amount towards the expenses of the court. This matter naturally will be decided by a resolution of the Security Council and the General Assembly of the United Nations. Now there is a third category. Third category happened to be, which is expressed in Article 34, a non-member of the United Nations, who is not a member at all, but then who in a particular dispute intends to invoke the protection of the court and go before the International Court of Justice. A non-member which intends to go before the International Court of Justice in a particular dispute and accept the jurisdiction of the court. Now, when it accepts the jurisdiction of the court, naturally they should give an undertaking. In the event of a decision by the International Court of Justice, the judgment of the International Court of Justice will be implemented to the satisfaction of every one concerned, to its letter and spirit. Suppose, for example, a particular state which is not a member of the United Nations wants the case to be heard by the International Court of Justice between states, and it is accepted. But then there will be an undertaking. In the event of a decision, the judgment will be implemented to its legal spirit. In the third case, the expenses towards the court in the concerned case will be decided by the court itself. So the court decides and tells the rest of the world, this is the expense which the concerned party, which is a non-member, wanted to the ICJ to give or to deliver a judgment in a particular case. In such situations, the ICJ itself decides this many dollars, this sum of dollars will have to be paid towards the expenses of the court. So the major difference between the second and the third is, remember, only for certain decisions it goes, and expenses are determined by the court itself, how much it should pay. Now in the second, most important thing is, it wants to keep an association only with the statute of the court and the matter to be decided by the court. Here the expenses of court are determined only by the Security Council and the General Assembly of the United Nations. Now the other thing, most important thing that is being spoken is jurisdiction of the World Court. How jurisdiction of the World Court, how the International Court of Justice exercises the jurisdiction. Now when we speak about the jurisdiction, you might be knowing, under the Charter of United Nations itself, in a few chapters it is indicated that in the event of a dispute, the matter shall be referred to the International Court of Justice. Now for example, you just take into consideration Part 6 of the Charter of United Nations relating to pacific settlement of international disputes. The matter relating to the pacific settlement of international disputes, ultimately, remember, if the pacific settlement of are not required or not accepted by a particular party, and the Security Council or the refers the matter should be decided by the ICJ, as there are certain legal questions, it has to be referred to the International Court of Justice itself. Now there are several United Nations treaties today, and in these several United Nations treaties it is clearly indicated that certain matters are to be decided by the International Court of Justice only. So for example, a convention is signed. When a new convention is signed, or under the United Nations, as I mentioned to you earlier, now these conventions naturally provide a provision. And the provision clearly indicates, in the event of a dispute, the matter has to be referred to the International Court of Justice for a judicial opinion or a decision. Now, most important part, because it is provided in the various treaties, as well as under the Charter of United Nations, as well as under the draft conventions which are adopted since 1945. So in whichever convention they have indicated that the matter should be referred to the International Court of Justice, the matter has to be, remember, referred to the International Court of Justice only. Now the important thing is, this is called as all matters which are provided under the Charter of United Nations itself. Now the second one is jurisdiction may be accepted under Article 36(2), which is called as an optional clause. Now suppose, for example, a particular optional clause simply means the parties to a particular case intends to accept the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice as compulsory. So at that time, suppose for example, it is called as an optional clause. So in one of the cases, the parties accept the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice as optional. And when it says it is optional, now it may say it is compulsory and it has to be referred to. Now the other important thing that is being spoken is, all decisions relating to the International Court of Justice, remember, are referred to the International Court of Justice by way of a compromise. So if the matter has to be referred to the International Court of Justice, there should be a compromise, an agreement. And the agreement clearly points out that in the matter involves a legal question and it has to be sorted out by the International Court of Justice only. Suppose, for example, there was a dispute between the state of Albania as well as the state of United Kingdom relating to the Corfu Channel. Now, at that time, remember, the Deputy Foreign Minister of the state of Albania had written to the Registrar of the International Court of Justice saying that we hereby accept the jurisdiction of the court. So the letter which was written by the Registrar of the state of Albania, the Deputy Foreign Minister of the state of Albania to the Registrar of the court was good enough. The International Court of Justice said, since the Deputy Foreign Minister has written to us, we exercise jurisdiction. Or suppose, for example, before the matter is referred, there will be an agreement between the parties. In all cases, suppose, for example, in the event of a dispute, and if no resolution is possible, without referring to the court, then enter into a compromise. And in the compromise, naturally, they go to the extent of pointing out the matter shall be decided by the International Court of Justice, and hence they submit to the jurisdiction of the court. So nicely it is being said. So any dispute can be referred to the International Court of Justice by the states who are disputants by entering into an agreement, compromise. And this agreement in one of its clauses clearly indicates we accept the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, and hence this issue is submitted to the International Court of Justice, and hence the court is supposed to exercise. Now the difference is the third one, jurisdiction may be accepted under Article 36. This is called as an optional clause. Parties may declare any time that they recognize compulsorily and without special agreement any other state accepting the same. So here there is no special agreement. They simply accept the jurisdiction of the court. That is what we call as the compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. Now when we go to the other type of thing, one is the court will hear regularly. Then there will be called as another type of a case which may come before the International Court of Justice. This is called as the advisory opinions. The advisory opinion is allowed only for the what we call as specialized agencies or the United Nations organ. So advisory opinion is not allowed for states. So all legal questions pertaining to the international organizations like the WTO maybe, or the UNESCO, or maybe some other bodies, United Nations General Assembly, may be referred to for an advisory opinion. Advisory opinions, although it is an advisory opinion, strictly speaking, there are no parties to it. And the role that is being played there the respective states to the United Nations organization is only to supply or to provide assistance through materials. They may ask for evidence, they ask for data, they ask for preliminary data. All of them will have to be collected by the Secretariat to the United Nations through the Office of Secretary General, who is the representative, and it will be given to the concerned agents. And in advisory opinion, there are no, strictly speaking, there are no parties at all. That is what Professor Bhavet points out. Now, with which we go to discuss one more important development, the development relating to what we call as the development of international law by the International Court of Justice. Then, before I speak about the development of international law by the International Court of Justice, you might be knowing under Article 36, when once the jurisdiction is accepted, the International Court of Justice is supposed to decide what matters. That may be interested to you. When I speak about the matters which are to be decided by the court are the following matters rather. All matters especially relating to the interpretation of a treaty. So, a party to a dispute may refer to the International Court of Justice a particular case relating to the interpretation of a treaty of which they have entered into. So, how it should be interpreted? Suppose, for example, the interpretation may be diverse. So, what happens is, since the treaties, the United Nations is written in 5 languages, the Chinese, the Spanish, the English and French and other, Russian. Now, when it is written, the interpretations might differ. You may be interpreting by taking the English version, and other one may be taking the Russian version, and interpretation may be totally different. In situations like this, the matter may be referred to the International Court of Justice for the interpretation of treaty to know the correct version. Then the second one is, the matter may be referred to the International Court of Justice to know a decision on the right law that is relating to a question of international law. What exactly the rule of international law on this subject? Any question of international law. Then the other one, the fourth one is, the third one, the determination of the quantum of reparation. In a particular case, what is the quantum of reparation? How much damages are to be paid by the awarded by the International Court of Justice to the parties? Suppose, for example, it is a serious case wherein loss is being inflicted by the other state. To determine this matter, to determine the amount of compensation in liquidated sum, you go to the court of law. And when you go to the International Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice has the competence to determine the quantum of reparation. Now, the fourth important thing is the existence of any fact which, if established, constitute an international obligation. Now, for example, the existence of any fact which, if it established, constitute an international obligation. Now, when I speak about it, suppose, for example, there are certain facts, but these facts are to be established before the international community. And if these facts are established, remember, in order to establish this, you go to the International Court of Justice and seek legal opinion. Because if it is found true, that will be an international obligation on the member parties who have gone before the International Court of Justice. Now, on these matters, the International Court of Justice is empowered to decide the concerned matter. Now, when we go further, most important thing is the development of international law by the International Court of Justice. See, if the International Court of Justice, as well as its predecessors, the Permanent Court of International Justice, has given wonderful decisions. They have tried to refine international law. They have tried to define international law. They have tried to promote international law. They have tried to, develop the whole concept of international law to the fullest over a period of time. Now, the League of Nations has given as many as 38 decisions, including advisory opinions. In advisory opinions, you have only international organizations seeking a legal opinion from the International Court. Now, in all these matters, I can just tell you a few of them under the League and a few of them under the Charter of United Nations. First, let us take under the League of Nations itself. Now, under the League of Nations, you might be knowing the Corso factory indemnity case came to the Permanent Court of International Justice in 1928. And when it came before the International Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice pointed out what we call as the doctrine of res judicata is a basic principle of general principle of law recognized by the civilized nations. The doctrine of res judicata is a principle which is recognized in civil law. And the principle which is being recognized in civil law has to become part and parcel of international law as well. Now, the other one is the Mavromatis Palestine's case came up in the year 1924 before the Permanent Court of International Justice. The doctrine of subrogation was recognized as a general principle of law recognized by the civilized nations. This was accepted, it was honored by the International Court. Now, thereafterwards, remember, the principle of good faith was recognized as the general principle of law recognized by the civilized nations in another case. Now, the third case happened to be the diversion of water from the river Meuse. And in diversion of water from the river Meuse, the International Court of Justice, the Permanent Court pointed out what we call as the Anglo-American equitable doctrines are general principles of law recognized by civilized nations. There were lots and lots of decisions which are given. That is why I said it tried to refine, it tried to define, it tried to promote and tried to develop rules of international law. Now, when we come to the present International Court of Justice, I shall tell you briefly 3 or 4 cases so that you come to know the point better, how it developed rules of international law. Now, one important case which came before the International Court of Justice happened to be the reparation case of 1949. When the United Nations came to be established, for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security, there were several officers of the United Nations who were sent to different parts of the world. And remember, these officers were serving as chief truce negotiators in different parts of the world. So one such instance happened to be the instance of Colonel Bernadette. Colonel Bernadette, a Swedish national, was working in the new city of Jerusalem as a truce negotiator. When he was carrying on his duties during the course of employment, he was killed by a gang of terrorists. When he was killed by a gang of terrorists, the United Nations, remember, had sleepless night. If the United Nations employees during the course of employment were to be killed, what course of action should be pursued? And the matter was referred to the International Court of Justice for an opinion. Now, legal opinion, when it was sought from the International Court of Justice, there were 3 questions which were formed. I shall just in a nutshell point to you. The first question clearly points out, in the event of an employee or an agent of the United Nations serving in some parts of the world, if this agent were to be killed by a gang of terrorists, can the United Nations, as the employer, maintain a cause of action? That's the first question. The second question, if the answer is yes, can the United Nations claim compensation for itself? The third one, can the United Nations maintain a cause of action for the loss of its life and to the family? So in all the cases, 3 cases, the United Nations, the 3 questions, the United Nations International Court of Justice said yes. And in the concluding part, it said United Nations has a personality of its own. It can sue as well as be sued in its own name. So this decision was supposed to be a remarkable landmark decision delivered by the International Court of Justice. United Nations has a personality of its own. It can sue and be sued. And if you look to the judgments, you get to know 50 member states, when they come together, and having come together collectively, they accept a treaty and to carry out the provisions of the treaty. And in the event of non-observance, the concerned recalcitrant state is answerable and it should pay damages. And United Nations can maintain an action for itself for the loss of its reputation. It can maintain an action for the loss of its family, for the loss of the individual. That was what was decided. And once that was decided, the question, remember, of personality need not be decided at a later stage. That is how it has persuasive effect, although the decisions of the International Court of Justice is not binding on itself. Now the second one happened to be a case which came up, Anglo-Norwegian fisheries case of 1950. The Anglo-Norwegian fisheries case of 1950 is an important case for the simple reason, for the first time, a question relating to the law of the sea came in before the Permanent Court of International the International Court of Justice. Now in the case, I shall just tell you the facts of the case so that you will be in a position to appreciate the decision as well. Now the coast of Norway is deeply indented. It is in a full of curvature form, in a zigzag form. Now it is in curvature form because not it is man-made. It is because of geography, it is because of morphology. Geographical features, morphological features are responsible in keeping the coastline of the state of Norway deeply indented. And when it was deeply indented, they were not in a position to adopt what we call as the straight baseline over its coast. So when it was not in a position to adopt a straight baseline over its coast, from which the outer area of the territorial sea is measured generally. When it was not possible, remember the King of Norway in the year 1937 adopted a decree. And this decree has selected 48 points from the coast. And these 48 points, remember, were either what we call as the fissures or rocks or sedimentary species, the place, and the what we call as small islands, etc., etc., etc. So remember, fissures, rocks, then other areas within the coast will be connected. These are the points, and a straight line will be drawn. And when this straight line is being drawn over it, the area which is inward side of the shore is called as what we call as internal waters, and the area which is outside is called as the territorial sea of the concerned state. Remember, it may be a new invention in those days, and by doing this, the state of Norway got as many as 1,000 nautical miles or more as the territorial sea in its coast, and more in internal waters as well. Now the state of Great Britain objected to this. The state of Great Britain pointed out, you are violating a rule of customary international law, it cannot be accepted. We have no objection of your adoption of 4-mile nautical mile territorial limit. But then selecting these points by way of baselines and selecting it as box method and saying outside the area beyond this line is territorial sea, inward side is, remember, internal waters, cannot be accepted because it is a violation of customary rule of international law. When there was no compromise that was possible, they entered into a compromise, an agreement. And having entered into an agreement, they refer the matter to International Court of Justice. And International Court of Justice, remember, heard the case and then they gave a decision. And when they gave the decision, they pointed out what was done by the state of Norway is perfect. It is perfect for the simple reason the coast is in zigzag form or it is in curvature form, it is in indented form. So in situations like this, remember, it is just not possible to have a straight, what we call as the baseline. Since it is not possible to adopt a straight baseline or a line, what we call as selecting certain points over the coast, maybe islands, maybe rocks, maybe fissures, and joining them is ideal and it is perfect. Now this was a revolutionary decision. Remember this much, a revolutionary decision which was given by the International Court of Justice in the year 1951. And when this decision was given, remember, many were taken by surprise. Now we are interested only in knowing the very decision of the International Court of Justice became part and parcel of not only customary law at a later stage, but it became a part of conventional law of the sea as well. In the Geneva Convention of 1958 on the law of the sea, now when they said, measuring the base, what we call as the baseline or the territoriality of a particular country, they said either the low water mark method or the baseline method. Now here, in situations like this, the low water mark method cannot be followed because it is in indented form. So where it is in indented form, naturally adopt the baseline. It became a conventional rule. What was accepted by the Geneva Convention of Law of the Sea of 1958 was adopted again in the main convention of the Law of the Sea of 1982 as well. See, such landmark decisions were given by the International Court of Justice in this case. Now the other important judgments which I just wanted to speak to you, advisory opinions as well. When I speak about the advisory opinions, the other day I had pointed to you the differences between the Security Council on the one hand and the General Assembly. Here the General Assembly refers a particular case to the International Court of Justice through a legal question. Can the General Assembly admit a particular state as a member of the United Nations under the criteria other than stipulated under Article 4? Under Article 4, first and foremost, all states should be states. They should be peace-loving. They should be willing to do so. Now, other than this, any other criteria could be adopted. The International Court of Justice said, no, nothing doing. It cannot be done. Now, the second advisory, this is in 1948, 1950 again, another matter came in, and they said, can the General Assembly alone admit a particular member without the consent of the Security Council? Then said, it will defeat the very objective and purpose of the United Nations. First one is the recommendation of the Security Council for purpose of admitting a particular member is very much essential. And only when, remember, it gives a recommendation, you are empowered to admit or to reject. It is your choice. This was another landmark decision. Now the third one happened to be in the Security Council during the course of the meeting, all the meetings participate. And having participated and they shout also. And at the time of voting, they just abstain from voting. In SP, they don't want to vote. They just go out and they will be there outside the Security Council. And again, after the voting procedure, take over and come back and participate in the meetings. Now, International Court of Justice, remember, said abstention tantamounts to concurrence. And this was referred to an advisory opinion for by the Security Council to the International Court of Justice. So abstention naturally tantamounts to concurrence. You are supporting the majority decision. Now the other important case which I had just mentioned to you the other day, the same famous certain expenses case. Now for all matters pertaining to enforcement action are the prerogative of the Security Council. Now suppose, for example, due to East-West rivalry or some other rivalry, a member of the Security Council casts his veto. Having cast his veto, it will see to it that no decision is taken by the Security Council. In such a situation, the matter from the agenda of the Security Council goes to the General Assembly. And the General Assembly, having discussed, passes the United Nations peacekeeping resolution, and the United Nations peacekeeping forces are constituted and sent to the troubled spot. They go and try to abstain and to remain where they were. Both the parties should without fight should remain in their areas. Now when this was done, the expenses that were incurred for the United Nations force came in. And Soviet Russia said, we are not going to approve it. We will not approve it because you have encroached the powers of this the powers of the Security Council. Since the General Assembly has encroached the powers of the Security Council, we are not going to approve the financial implications that are involved. Now, the matter goes to the International Court of Justice. And International Court of Justice in the famous certain expenses case in 1962 pointed out the primary task of responsibility of maintaining peace and security rests with the Security Council, but not the exclusive responsibility. You are supposed to act and maintain peace and security. If you don't act, another organ, which is also equally powerful under Article 10 and 11, is empowered to exercise and take up the matter. This was what International Court of Justice said. So primary responsibility rests with the Security Council, but not the exclusive responsibility. That was another case that was decided by this. Now in the year 1954, the other important case happened to be the effect of awards to the Administrative Tribunal of 1954. Now what has happened was, in order to keep the efficiency, honesty, integrity and high standards to the United Nations employees, an administrative tribunal was constituted by the General Assembly. And this administrative tribunal is composed of 7 members who are experts in international administrative law and international law. Now, in the event of a dismissal of an employee of the United Nations, in the event of a suspension of the employee of United Nations appointed by the Secretary General, they can seek and go and seek protection of the administrative tribunal. Now, what has happened was, in one of the cases, remember, some of the United Nations employees have leaked out information. Leaking information is a professional misconduct. And the matter was heard, and the Secretary General dismissed a few, suspended a few, and thereafterwards gave compensation, packed a few. And these members challenge the very act done by the Secretary General before the International Court of Justice by way of an advisory opinion. And when this was challenged before the International Court of Justice, the first one is the General Assembly contended that since it has appointed the Administrative Tribunal, since the General Assembly has appointed the Administrative Tribunal, its judgment is not binding on the General Assembly, because it has created it. How it can be? Then the International Court of Justice, having gone through almost all the documents, pointed out, first and foremost, it was a judicial organ. In the Travax preparatories, you get to know it was a judicial organ. A judicial organ, remember, naturally, when it takes up the matter to protect the United Nations employees, and after having heard the entire case by taking into consideration almost all the issues, naturally the decision of the Administrative Tribunal is binding on the General Assembly. It is res judicata. It is binding between the parties. The judgment is binding on the Administrative Tribunal. It is binding even on, remember, the General Assembly of the United Nations. Such a classic decision which was given by the International Court of Justice in the Administrative Tribunal case. Now you might be knowing, I just wanted to speak to you a few more Southwest Africa cases. Now when I speak about Southwest Africa cases, you should be knowing the League of Nations under Article 22 of the Peace of Paris had created what we call as the mandate system of the United Nations. When I speak about the mandate system of the United Nations, there were certain states in those days, in 1919, who were not in a position to govern themselves. These states were illiterate, ignorant, and they were not knowing anything. And such states should be placed under what we call as the mandate system of the League of Nations. And there were 2 other types of states also which could come in. The second type of category is any state which is willing to submit itself. Oh, here the first one is the League of Nations itself put under the mandate. The second one is any state which is willing to come under the mandate system of the League of Nations could also come in. Now the third category is all the states which are detached as a result of the First World War, which are detached, remember, as a result of the First World War could also come under the mandate system of the League of Nations. Now what is this mandate? The mandate system of the League of Nations envisages 2 things. One is the mandated states and the second one is the mandatory. When I speak about the mandatory, a powerful state, a regional state or a neighbor will be appointed to look after the mandated states, which is poor, which is illiterate, which is ignorant. And remember, what we call as the mandatory, which is taking care of the state, should work under the supervision of the League of Nations. Now, one instance happened to be an instance relating to South Africa, which was appointed as a mandatory to look after the territory of Southwest Africa or Namibia. South Africa happened to be a mandatory. Namibia, Southwest Africa, is called as the mandate territory, and which was functioning under the auspices of the League of Nations, and it had to submit annual reports, etc., etc. Now the League died a natural death in 1945. And when the Charter of United Nations came in, it provided for another principal organ, which is called the trusteeship system of the United Nations. Article 75 to 86 of the Charter of United Nations speaks about the Trusteeships Council. Now when it speaks about the Trusteeships Council, remember, there instead of the mandate system, it is the Trusteeship Council. The Trusteeships Council is composed of the members of the Security Council and the General Assembly. Remember, the Secretary General and the office of the trusteeship system, who are appointed by the United Nations, take care of it. Here, the supervising state, a powerful supervising state will be appointed to look after the territory which is poor, ignorant, etc., etc. And naturally, South Africa was taking care of the administered state of the Southwest Africa or Namibia. In the United Nations, when it came in, initially once or twice it submitted reports. South Africa submitted reports to the United Nations. But then at a later stage it refused to submit. It kept quiet, did not submit. And when questions were asked, it said, we are supposed to submit reports only under the League of Nations. Now the League of Nations today is not in existence. It is a defunct organ. It has finished its life. It has finished its course of life. Since it has finished its course of life, we need not submit. Now at this juncture, the matter was referred by the United Nations to the International Court of Justice, seeking three legal questions. Answer to the three legal questions. The first one is there an obligation on the part of South Africa to submit reports to the United Nations? One. The second one is whether Chapter 12 of the Charter of United Nations is applicable to this case. Chapter 12 exclusively deals with the trusteeship system of the United Nations. Now the third legal question is, can South Africa on its own unilaterally alter the treaty status? Now for all these International Court of Justice, it gave such a beautiful opinion. Now for the first question is whether Chapter 12 of the Charter is applicable. One, can South Africa alone alter its status? Then what we call as is there still an obligation on the part of South Africa to submit to the supervision? The International Court of Justice, having looked into the mandate system of the League of Nations, as well as the present trusteeship system of the United Nations, it pointed out, earlier the powers were exercised by the mandate system. Now similar powers or the same powers are exercised under the trusteeship system of the United Nations, especially between Articles 75 to 86. And naturally, South Africa should come under the supervision of the United Nations, and Chapter 12 is applicable. Now for the second question, can South Africa alone alter its status? Remember, the treaty of mandate system of the League of Nations was entered by the parties and the United Nations. One party is the League of Nations, and the other one is South Africa, and along with the people of mandated territory. How can a particular state alter unilaterally its own stature and status? It is not possible. It is totally unacceptable. That is what the International Court of Justice pointed out. Now then, is there still duty on the part of South Africa to submit to the jurisdiction? The International Court of Justice pointed out, this is a case relating to the succession of international organizations. In cases relating to succession of international organization, when one organ which is established to maintain peace and security has finished its course, and another organ has come into life and into force, that organ has the power to exercise jurisdiction over similar matters which are similarly exercised by the earlier organs. And International Court of Justice, remember, in the 1970 decision points out the very presence of South Africa in Southwest Africa or Namibia is illegal. The very practice of South Africa in Namibia, especially racial apartheid, is illegal. South Africa should leave the territory of Southwest Africa and pave way for self-determination by the Southwest Africa. And Southwest Africa ultimately became an independent nation. This was a remarkable decision which was given by the International Court of Justice in 3 phases. That is why in 3 phases, that is why it is called as Southwest Africa cases. The first one in 1950, the second one in 1966, and the third one is in 1970. Then we go to the famous Nicaragua case. In the Nicaragua case, this is a matter which relates to what we call as intervention. And in this case relating to intervention, the International Court of Justice have defined the parties where Nicaragua went to the International Court of Justice saying that here is a state wherein it has violated the Treaty of Friendship and Trade and did not even bother. And the state of the United States even did not appear before the International Court of Justice. And the state of Nicaragua requested the court, remember, to issue an interim order. For the first time, the International Court of Justice in Nicaragua case pointed out it has inherent powers to issue interim order. It's a major, remember, development that has taken place in the year 1985, wherein at that time Dr. Nagendra Singh happened to be the president of the World Court. Then we have Barcelona Traction case. In the Barcelona Traction case, the International Court of Justice for the first time pointed out that the liability of shareholders is always limited. The liability of shareholders is limited, and this is being practiced in what we call as the company law of national states. And what was practiced in the company law of national states is incorporated even into the field of international law. Then we have another important case that is being known as the Pulp Mills case of 1910. And in the Pulp Mills case of 1910, for the first time, the International Court of Justice, remember, tried to protect the biodiversity of the state of Uruguay as well as the state of Argentina. And it called people should get clean water, clean drinking water. People should have the facilities of recreation, and people should have the mammals or should be available by way of food and other things. And the International Court of Justice thus has done wonderful work. When I go further, India had, remember, judges in the International Court of Justice as well. You might be knowing Nagendra Singh became the president of the World Court. Before Nagendra Singh, M.C. Chagla in the year 1960, in the dispute between India and Portugal over the right of passage or Indian territory case, was an ad hoc judge only for that case. Then we have another judge who was the Justice R.S. Pathak. He was the Chief Justice of India. Then he was appointed by the judge of the International Court of Justice for the remaining term of Justice Nagendra Singh. Then we have Justice Dalveer Bhandari as a judge of the International Court of Justice, who is still the judge. Now, International Court, remember, in its decisions have promoted international law, refined international law. Various questions of international law have come in. And the International Court of Justice today has lots and lots of work. And this is the message that is being spoken about the United Nations system. Thank you.